Good morning. Welcome. Okay, good morning. I think we'll get started now. Thank you all for coming. Welcome. My name is Dana Merwin. I'm the program officer at IDA. Today, I'm greeting you from the ancestral lands of the Ohlone people, also known as the Bay Area, California. Today, our guests will be doing audio descriptions. These add to the experience for our visually impaired guest. For instance, I'm a white woman with medium length brown hair, curly, plus 3 gray hairs for now. I'm wearing a green shirt and I have a dark wood background. Before we begin, I have a few more technical notes about this presentation. I want to thank today's ASL interpretation, which is provided by Andrea Lust. Thank you, Andrea. And our CART captioner, Tina Dillon. Thank you, Tina. To access live captions for this event, simply click on the CC button at the bottom on screen captions. We've also dropped into the chat a link to the live transcript. If you're unable to stay for the entire session or want to share it in the future, today's session will be posted on our YouTube channel. And we will be emailing a link when that is posted later. We encourage you to use the chat. We have a community here at IDA that we want to foster. So please use the chat today. You'll find support from our colleagues, and I want to thank them. Nikki, Leanne, Cassidy, and Kenny will be in the background today, so thank you. And the chat is great for conversation with each other, but today's panel will be taking questions. We need you to put those in the Q&A function, which is separate from the chat. So become familiar with your Zoom screen and look for that Q&A function, and that is where we want you to put your wonderful questions for our guests today, okay? If you do have any questions in the chat, our IDA folks will help you. Today's conversation, Pere Lorenz Documentaries Challenging White Supremacy, is in conjunction with the Pere Lorenz Documentary Fund, made possible by the New York Community Trust. The fund provides $115,000 in production and post-production grants to independent documentary films that illuminate issues in the United States. Applications are open now through June 28th, and more information on the criteria and the application link can be found at documentary.org. So without further delay, I am pleased to introduce our esteemed moderator for this exciting conversation. He is NPR's TV critic and author of Race Baiter: How the Media Wields Dangerous Words to Divide a Nation. Please welcome Eric Deggans. Welcome.
Hi, hey everybody. Thanks a lot for allowing me to be a part of this. And just for the description, I'll say that I'm a middle-aged Black man with a few more gray hairs maybe than Dana has. I have a salt and pepper goatee. I wear glasses. I have a dark blue suit on with a white shirt. And over my shoulder there, you will see my book called Race Baiter that's about race in media. So feel free to check that out if you have a chance. So I'm really glad to have a chance to talk to you guys and moderate this conversation because you know, I do a lot of work where I talk about race in media, and I'm really interested in how documentarians are going to explore this space. And that's one of the things that we're going to talk about today. So first, let's get Poe up, the director of the IDA's Documentary Fund. because I'd like to talk to her a little bit about the theme of the evening or the day, and the why this was chosen for the documentary fund, and what it means. And we also have a couple of great filmmakers with us, John Cesare Goff and Hillary Pierce, and we'll talk to them in a second. But first, I wanted to start with Poe. If you could talk a little bit about why you chose this theme, challenging white supremacy, for the Pere Lorentz Fund, and what it will mean for filmmakers to try and meet that theme in the proposals or the ideas they might submit to you.
Before I do that, Eric, I just thought I'd also introduce to talk a little bit just visually on what I look like, I guess. So I'm an Asian woman with shoulder-length black hair and a black sweater, and I am based in Washington, D.C., the home of the Nacotchtank and Piscataway people. And to your question, Eric, how and why did we choose challenging white supremacy for this year's Pere Lorentz grants theme? Earlier this year, myself, Dana, Merwin, and Kenny Brown were part of the grants team. We were sort of thinking, what would be a good theme that would sort of encapsulate what's been going on in the past year, what's been going on for the past 400 years. And unfortunately, it's going to be an issue for a long time to come. And we were doing a lot of thinking, and I'd say there's so much talk about systemic racism, and there should be continuous conversations about that. But a lot of times when you bring it up in conversation, it's very difficult for some people to talk about the roots of systemic racism. It's like they almost can't say the word white supremacy. And you're laughing, Eric.
I have been there, my sister. I have been there.
you know what I mean. And so it's like, how can we talk about systemic racism without talking about white supremacy? It is not possible. There's no systemic racism without white supremacy in the United States. It's foundational, to the birth of this nation. So we thought about it, we talked about it, and it's like, we have to go with this theme. It's there's no neutering or toning down language. That would be the wrong thing to do. And so thinking of all that, we decided, yes, this year's Pere Lorentz grants theme, it has to be that. It has to be challenging white supremacy. And our hope as a grants team is that, our filmmakers who are applying to this grant, that they will think deeply about this theme, what it means to them to interrogate white supremacist structures in their lives, and propose a documentary that, would maybe go beyond what we see in the news. And I would like to add, Eric, like for some folks, the nature, for some of our friends and some folks from our community, by nature of being, they are challenging white supremacy. For some of us, and I speak for myself, there's a lot of interrogation and introspection that needs to be done in terms of my personal adjacency to white supremacy. And then for others as well, and for many of us as well, it's also our inheritance from white supremacy and the benefits that we've gotten. So that's why we chose this theme.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. So let's bring in our filmmakers. John Cesare Goff first. Your film, After Sherman, talks a bit about land ownership. And perhaps you could talk a little bit about how your film and what you're working on might connect to this theme of challenging white supremacy, to help our audience get a sense of how a film could speak to this idea and these themes.
Sure. First, thanks so much for the invitation to be on the panel. I'm zooming in from the unceded territory of the Lenape in Brooklyn, New York, and I'm a Black male with a long unkept goatee and an even longer high top situation, and I'm wearing glasses in my home office in Crown Heights. So yeah, my film After Sherman I think addresses it um, in what I would consider probably the most direct way, and I borrow it from the work of Toni Morrison, in which I sort of reconnected, re-entered my homeland, my family's area in Georgetown, South Carolina, and to me, it's a world that exists outside of the gaze of whiteness. So much like in Sula, where the folks actually lived on the top of the hill, but it was called the bottom because the white community made them feel like it was not a desirable location. Same with the coastal area of the Southeast United States, which is also known as the Gullah Geechee Heritage Corridor. Prior to the Civil War, the county where my family is primarily from, Georgetown County, which is north of Charleston, was over 95% African. And so you're talking about a community that was already existing and thriving, certainly under white supremacy, but independent with its own values and ethos, many of which have become infused within our cultural tradition. And so by uplifting this Gullah Geechee culture and the land ownership and the investment that descendants of enslaved Africans have made in this country, it is, in my opinion, shifting the gaze into an interiority that privileges Blackness.
That sounds amazing and a lot to tackle. And I want to come back to ask you about the challenges of tackling these kind of things. But let's bring in Hillary and Hillary Pierce and talk about your film At the Ready. Now, your film focuses on Latino films or Latino students who are participating in this youth program that kind of acts like a funnel into the Border Patrol. And so can you talk a little bit about your film and how you think it relates also to these themes that we're talking about?
Yeah, hi, I'm Hillary, and I'm honored to be with you guys today. I am coming to you from the traditional lands of the Mescalero Apache and the Humanos people in Marfa, Texas. And I am a white cisgender woman with longish, wavy brown hair, wearing an orange shirt, and I have a plant and a framed black and white photo behind me. The film that we just premiered a few months ago is called At the Ready, and it's a really intimate kind of direct cinema look at the lives of 3 teenagers in El Paso, Texas. And they're each the children of immigrants. They're all Hispanic, and they participate in a law enforcement education program at their high school. That is a really common program in Texas high schools, and it's something akin to JROTC for students to kind of begin training toward a career in law enforcement. So it does function very much as kind of an early start into a career in Border Patrol or even local policing, or other branches of law enforcement, all of which are represented in El Paso. Every branch of law enforcement is represented in El Paso, and it serves as kind of the primary and exclusive option for a solid middle class existence for young people who want to stay in El Paso or can only afford to stay in El Paso, whatever their circumstances may be. So for many of these teenagers, they see this this club. It's also an after-school club in addition to just an education track within the high school where they can take classes. They see this as a really great financial opportunity Many of them are not aware of other opportunities that would pay as well and would allow them to stay near family. So the way which I think the film relates to the topic is, every time I've shared the film with anybody or told them what the film is about, many are very, very surprised to learn that A, a program like this exists, and B, that Hispanic children would want to participate in it, given how it kind of contributes to the community, or affects their community. And I think it's important. I know we talk a lot about awareness, but this is sort of a different kind of awareness, is really understanding on a ground level what different communities are experiencing. And these teenagers are very vulnerable and open in the film, and really share from their heart what they're thinking and how they're mulling over, what they're dealing with, both their challenges, their opportunities. And as the film continues, each of them begin to realize how a career in law enforcement might be at odds with their family, their ethics, and may not contribute to their community in the way that they had hoped. So as far as challenging white supremacy, I think it's important to illuminate situations like this where, most of us are aware of the origins of Border Patrol and police forces in America and why they exist in the first place. So to put young people in a position where they have such limited opportunities that they would, seek out a career in a system that was built to oppress them and people that they love. I think it's something that is not maybe known by a lot of casual viewers, or white people elsewhere that do not live on the border or in communities like this.
Yeah. And, I think what you've just said, Hillary, kind of connects to something that Poe said earlier. This idea that in America, we are encouraged to not see white supremacy. We are encouraged to either ignore it or downplay it or avoid it or not call it what it is. And so when it comes time for a filmmaker to think about creating a project that's going to be about this theme, challenging white supremacy, I wanted to ask both of you, and maybe direct this question to John first. What are the typical stumbling blocks, mistakes you might make, difficulties you might have when you're a filmmaker trying to come up with some idea that's going to challenge white supremacy, given that we're in this environment where so many of us are encouraged to not acknowledge it at all?
Yeah, I think for me that that occurs on several levels. And first, it's formally, there's a lot of desire to encourage filmmakers to speak to a particular audience, and that audience may not be the intended audience for the filmmakers. So in my instance, I'm speaking to Black Americans. Over 40% came in through the Port of Charleston, and therefore are likely descendants or themselves Gullah Geechee people, and yet unaware of this connection to place, this connection to identity, and sort of in doing so, even with like language barriers, the intention to subtitle dialects is white supremacy. And so when I'm coming at a project formally, and there are things that I choose to exclude because the audience that I'm speaking to is already aware of it, or at times when there's rhetoric occurring and we choose to muddle that sound, and people say, well, we don't really understand what's being said there. And I was like, but for the people who this is intended for, they already know. And so similar to as Du Bois and his double consciousness, like I'm seeking and striving, you know, in my film practice and my curatorial work in my life to create a double or triple consciousness in film, you know, and I think Ryan Coogler said it about, you know, superheroes, but I think it exists as well for nonfiction. What is this assumption that something that is in a language or in a tone directed to a non-white audience cannot be enjoyed by white people as well? You know, it's like, is it immediately a turnoff that I am going deep into a cultural identity that really exists outside of whiteness, you know? And do I have to re-explain the history that we all live and are traumatized by day in and day out? Like, why, you know? So on that first level, you know, I think that is one way to address white supremacy, and it's using signifiers, you know, internal signifiers that are Easter eggs for the people who are it's intended for, and those who miss it, like it just wasn't meant for them, and that's fine because the film can operate on multiple levels.
I always like to tell people, you know, Google works. You know, Google. So Hillary, I want to get your thoughts on that question, but I'm also interested in this idea of authorship and this question of I'm sure there are going to be filmmakers out there, white filmmakers, who want to do stories about challenging white supremacy that will involve telling the stories of people of color. And since you've done that in your film, can you talk a little bit about the delicate process of figuring out how you're going to do that and sort of be true to the people of color, but also bring your talents and your connections and your abilities and experience as a filmmaker to what you're doing?
Yeah, that's a topic that I've done a lot of soul searching and had a lot of conversations with fellow filmmakers and non-filmmakers about, and it's, you know, it's challenging to choose your projects and to hear voices. You know, some saying, tell what you know. You know, you hear so much about making projects, which, you know, John has intimate connections to his subject matter. And I think that can be challenging for some white filmmakers because they don't, I know that I, you know, have no real interest in, you know, making films that just continue to elevate white voices and uphold white supremacist structures. But I also don't want to, you know, step out of my lane, so to speak. And I think it's just a constant conversation. I know that for me, one of the way I approach it is to build a team that is very representative of the community that you are working with. Many people refer to the people in front of the camera in their films, in their documentary films, as characters or as subjects, and that's, you know, kind of historically how we've talked about it. But I've recently come across, you know, choosing the word participants to use, and I think that that's such a good idea, and it really I really liked it when I heard that people were kind of changing their word choice on how they discussed people who participated in the documentary, because for us, you know, it was so important to make sure that the stories being told were accurate, and how you know, these teenagers were being represented, that was true to who they were. And you know, we knew that we were a team of white women, and we really wanted to bring in more Mexican Americans and Mexicans, because El Paso, many people do know this, but El Paso and Juarez are really one metropolitan area. And it's an international community. So we built our team from both sides of the border in that metropolitan area. So, you know, we have a co-producer from Juarez, and he was on set nearly every single day. He also served as a sound mixer, and just kind of including the voices and bringing everybody to the table was a constant. It has to stay at the front of your mind. I think for me, that's kind of, it's not a choice just to hire a diverse crew and to call it that and to move on. For me, it was like constantly check in, constantly have those difficult conversations amongst yourself, check yourself, and have your, you know, team check one another. So yeah, I think it's important to just constantly re-examine your approach and who you're kind of bringing in to the team.
That makes sense. So Poe, I wanted to come back to you because I wondered, as you were trying to decide on this theme, whether there was any concern or you got any pushback from people who might say that choosing this theme would unfairly disadvantage white filmmakers, that they would be asked to talk about something that white people are not encouraged to think about, that white people often don't think about, and it might make it harder for them to develop a project that would qualify for this funding.
I think it's a very interesting question. I would think that thinking deeply about this theme, about challenging white supremacy, is really going to help everybody, including white filmmakers as well. What I find sometimes very, Eric, folks, if folks can't think about deeply about something as simple as white supremacy, how are you going to make films about systemic racism? I just don't know whether it's even possible. It's going to be so surface level. It's going to lack the honesty that's really needed in films, that we hopefully, want to present to our an audience and maybe possibly change their minds. And if we can't start from within, then how are we going to be able to make a film that's going to change minds, or maybe change minds and make people reflect and change their behaviors and attitudes? In thinking about this theme, Eric, like there's so many layers to white supremacy in documentary, and a lot of it, it really starts with the self. Even the idea of authorship, for example. Why is it so difficult for some filmmakers to address the question of authorship? Now, that is something we get quite a bit in terms of questions from applicants. Is there a template to write to answer the question of authorship? Well,
can you articulate that a little bit, the question of authorship, just so people know what you're talking about?
Absolutely. So authorship is a question that should be in all documentary film applications, and should be everything that we do, really, on who we are, our connection in relation to the story, to the subject, to our participants, to the community that's part of our documentary. And I would also go as far as to say the folks that we're working with and we're making these documentaries. And so for filmmakers who find it difficult to think or to reflect on the requirement of authorship in applications, I feel like there's a lot of soul searching that needs to be done. You're smiling, Eric. Can you tell me your thoughts on this? Because you've written so much about this and spoken so much about this. What is your experience, if I may?
Well, that's often a question in all types of television programming, and who is the true author? Who is actually creating this sensibility that you're seeing on screen? And what's been exciting for me as a critic of color to see in the last few years, especially, is that people of color, creators of color, filmmakers of color are snatching back narratives that used to be told by other people. And so we see a women step forward and produce a documentary about R. Kelly that gets him put in jail. We see Ava DuVernay step forward and retell the story of the Central Park Five using the words of the men themselves to construct the narrative rather than talking to the police. We see Barry Jenkins step up and do a compelling 10-episode version of the Underground Railroad that is all about talking about that experience from the perspective of Black people, talking to Black people. And if white people get something out of it, that's awesome. but that's not necessarily the point of it. And so we see women and oppressed people reclaiming their stories in ways that I think are very exciting, and could all of that could relate to the themes that you're talking about. I'm wondering, I'd like you to answer this question, and then maybe I'll kick it to John and Hillary. Are there typical mistakes that you see filmmakers make when they try to tackle these kinds of subjects? And what could you warn our audience against encroaching or getting near or doing as they try to think of themes that they would present to you for this fund?
When we think about challenging white supremacy as a theme, it's really broad. Like, to John's film After Sherman, which doesn't include whiteness or white people, that is a form of challenging white supremacy. To Hillary's film, which is so brilliant, which talks about systemic structures, white systemic structures, which is law enforcement, is prevalent in the theme, even though it's Latinx children, teenagers that are being trained to be members of law enforcement. So it's really such an open theme. And I would say that the mistakes that folks would make, if when thinking about this theme, is to not have an inclusive team to make your films. And this goes back to introspection and something that I think about a lot. I mean, even for myself, I lack sight. There's only so much that I can see. And so it's so important for us all to surround ourselves with people who can see different things, depending on the story that you want to tell. It would be a mistake, an absolute mistake, to tell a story of a certain community and not have anybody from that community or from that race or ethnicity or class or background to be able to help guide and tell the story together. Then it's just possibly, I mean, at the very best, it's a milquetoast film. Nobody could care much about whether or not it existed, but at the worst, one could be perpetuating very, very problematic problems, stereotypes, and we already know what comes out of those, problematic stories. You're perpetuating, a narrative that we're all, hopefully, as documentary filmmakers, trying to fight against.
That makes sense. So I just want to remind everyone, we're going to start reading your questions from the Q&A queue in just a few minutes. So if you have any thoughts, put them in there so that I can see them in advance and kind of queue them up for our panel. I wanted to go to John and sort of ask you, I believe you also work with the Ford Foundation, right? And so you get to see a lot of different projects and a lot of things that people are doing. What's your read on maybe the typical mistakes that people make, or where you see people do a great job of creating projects that challenge white supremacy? Is there a commonality there?
Yeah, I'll speak from multiple vantage points, which includes my position at Ford, my previous curatorial positions. And I feel like immediately after the Donald Trump election, there was this hyper effort to understand whiteness, and people missed what was happening, because by focusing on these single events, which become, national headlines and sensationalized, you're missing the systemic part of it that the judges elected during that presidency will resound for decades to come. The ill will towards neighbors, has built divisiveness that will create barriers and for years to come. And so it's not the immediate flash on the pan, it's what is the long story. And that's the privilege we have as documentarians, is that if you're not just a flash in the pan, super funded helicopter crew, you have the opportunity to really spend time with the story, you know, and to see it develop. And so what I am seeing now are people sort of like moving away from like, let's find the middle America white person who voted for Trump and like get their opinions, to like, let's understand how this community is situated within a larger context and how that affects other people's lives who may not be directly in the community, because that's the way systemic things work. And so I do think in this moment, now that people are starting to recover from the shock of the previous administration, people are, you know, catching their breath and telling stories with greater breadth.
That sounds great. Hillary, I wanted to ask you, like, it seems like a lot of your film is about these young teens slowly realizing the level of oppression that actually exists in these institutions that they're involved with. And I wonder if that was ever a process that you went through yourself, where you slowly or quickly realized what white supremacy was in America, what racial oppression was in America. And I wonder, now that you're doing the work you're doing, do you see it in other people? Do you see it in your audience? Do you see it in people that you're interviewing for these films? How does the curtain rise, I guess?
Yeah, I grew up in rural Eastern North Carolina, so not too far from where John's from. Very small town called Trenton, and you know, I was raised by pretty liberal pastor parents in a fairly conservative community. So I was always well educated about the history of racism, and saw a lot of it firsthand in my community. But I'll be completely honest with you, I was not introduced to the concept of white privilege until graduate school.
Wow.
And I was horrified when I really realized the weight of that. You know, I'm an educated person. I'd been gotten a bachelor's degree at that point, and I was getting my MFA, and to not have any like base level understanding of systemic racism. Actually, one of the things that really opened my eyes for the very first time was the absolutely brilliant documentary, The Trials of Daryl Hunt, that everyone should try to see. For me, it's a documentary about the wrongful conviction of a Black man, Daryl Hunt, in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, where I went to grad school, for the rape and murder of a white journalist. And you know, he was imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit, and that was the first time I really understood how the system was putting him there. And it just blew me away. And it's kind of one of those things where once you really understand it, everything is illuminated, and you see it all around you all the time, and it's always on my mind. So yeah, it's kind of crazy because you get frustrated. You wish you'd had that knowledge so much sooner, and I so like badly want you know to try to. I mean, I think our film is a good example of how much hope there is for that generation. I mean, I've watched the kids that you know, unfortunately came out of the Parkland shooting, and how they've really joined the national conversation. And I'm so heartened to know that the younger generation seem to be a lot more knowledgeable about these things at an earlier age. But I think we, especially white people, owe it to our children, to the younger people in our lives. I don't have children, but I have lots of nieces and nephews, friends, kids, that kind of thing, that I think it's on us to talk to them about those things early, so that they don't end up being a well-intentioned white person in graduate school learning about these things for the first time. Yeah.
Hear you. Well, let's turn to a few questions that we have in the Q&A. I'm going to go with the one from Dave Haft, who asks, in filming my own interracial family, how do you recommend I avoid white centering myself while also modeling for other white people common challenges when exploring my own whiteness on film? Hillary, I imagine that's probably a question for you.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
No, I was just processing. Yeah, that's a good question. So it sounds like it's a personal journey kind of narrative about this filmmaker's family. I think what I was saying earlier about your participants, I think that's so important this is something that all documentary filmmakers, I think, try to do, is, build a rapport, and you already have rapport when you're dealing with your family. Hopefully, yeah. So I think just kind of letting them know what you're trying to do and making sure that they're kind of on the inside of your intentions, make your intentions known. I think that's really important to have those conversations with them. As far as centering your whiteness, one thing that came to mind was like video confessionals or something. Like that's just a really practical idea that just came to mind. Like maybe including footage shot by your family members of color, and allowing them to sort of direct themselves in those moments. And I think a lot of it comes into play in the editing room as well. So obviously that's a very personal topic, so I don't know if the filmmaker is editing as well, but I think having a person of color in the post-production process where things really get removed or focused on, that would be a really important way to address that.
Yeah, that's wild. That when you first started answering, the first thing that popped in my head was give cameras to your non-white children and let them go, and then find out what the story looks like from their perspective, and make sure that you include that. I wonder, John or Poe, if you guys have any advice for Dave.
I'm gonna let John take this one.
It's complicated and nearly impossible. And as someone who's been doing a personal doc for 8 years, I don't think it has anything to do with race. It has to do with you being the filmmaker and interrogating your own family. But what I will say is important for filmmakers, and I'm saying this as a person who was a cinematographer for a number of years on long-term social justice docs. Some of the conversations need to take place off camera, and some of the honesty in your person, you just have to you have to own it, and I think that will translate, within the frame as well.
Makes sense.
Eric, if I may, there are so many, I've seen so many films about let's understand how white supremacist people think. And I really, I was formerly a commissioning editor, And I
Yeah.
always wondered, like, do we really need another one? I feel like there's also that as well. Like we see so much of, let's understand how white supremacists think in our media, in national media, in local media. And so do we really need to make a documentary about that? And I would implore and I would ask filmmakers, as they're thinking and reflecting on this theme and pitching something for Père Laurence, is there a need for it? And is that the way that, yourself as a filmmaker, you're challenging systemic racism and white supremacy?
Makes
Yes.
sense.
Eric, do you mind if I bounce back to the question before the last one? I was just really glad to hear Poe and John say what they said about how inclusive this topic actually is. I think for maybe some white filmmakers who are just so accustomed to making films and maybe not thinking about these things, white supremacy is so pervasive that you shouldn't look at this grant topic and think, oh, well, my film's about environmentalism, or, oh, my film's about agriculture, or, what have you, because I'd be willing to bet that white supremacy is in play in your topic, no matter what it is. And so I think it's kind of, I'm excited about this grant topic because I think it's going to force a lot of people to ask that question, is how is white supremacy at play in my topic, and to explore that more. And I think what John was saying about, more intimate ground level storytelling, if I was hearing him right, I think so many people think like, oh, a grant topic like challenging white supremacy, well, I wasn't going to make a film about challenging white supremacy. That's a whole can of worms.
Right.
It's not. It doesn't have to be. We made a film about 3 teenagers in a small, suburb of El Paso, and it completely eliminates a system that's in play to uphold white supremacy. So I think that's actually what's maybe not more eye-opening, but eye-opening in a different way is, we as documentary filmmakers know that character and emotion are what really connects with people. And so if you have the opportunity to tell a very intimate ground level story, with someone that shows how they are personally affected, and how that, and make those connections, then that is challenging white supremacy too.
Yeah, I mean, I set out to make an experimental documentary film, lyrical film about land, preferably with no people in it. And 2014 is when I started, in the shadow of the shooting of Michael Brown. Why? Because I was tired of the images of Black death and pain. And so I wanted to refocus my gaze and direct my camera elsewhere. And so from 2014 to now, my film transformed, not because I wanted it to, but because white supremacy exists. And so the Walter Scott shooting took place the following year. And I had been engaged with my mentor, who was helping me with the project, Senator Clementa Pinckney, who was then murdered a few months later. And so all of this is happening outside of the frame of the film I set out to make. And so, of course, my film transformed. And despite the desire for people to assume that the greatest atrocity in my film is the shooting at Mother Emanuel in Charleston, in which my parents were in the building 20 minutes before the gunman entered, that's not the greatest atrocity in my film. The greatest atrocity is the continued pillaging of Black owned land and the inability to develop it or for it to have worth without white people owning it or being adjacent to it. That is a continuous crime. And so within that container, there's hundreds of murders, you know, and violence being enacted on people. But that's, you know, like I don't have to focus my camera on that for that to be, you know, a part of the story.
Yeah, I agree. You know, I think a lot of times when we talk about race in these days, we wind up talking about the symptoms rather than the cause. We will debate affirmative action, or we'll talk about, you know, the unequal amount of deaths from COVID, or we'll talk about, you know, differences in family wealth. And all of those things are symptoms of a common disease, which is the disease of systemic racism and white supremacy in America. And I think if you see it in those terms, that an environmental story about Flint water could be about white supremacy, that, you know, Steve James' documentary about, you know, the Oak Park High School system could be a documentary about white supremacy, challenging white supremacy rather. That there's a lot of films out there that talk about a lot of different things, but at the core of the issue that they're exploring, white supremacy and challenging it is a part of it. So I think you know, part of the challenge to filmmakers is to be inventive and in how you meet that theme, because there's a lot of different ways to get to it. I'm going to ask this question from Wade, and then we'll have a final thought from Poe, and I think we'll have to wrap it up. But we've got a question from Wade Gardner, who asks, would the theme be met if a story used today's stories of the white power structure, specifically in law enforcement, such as systemic racism, health and economic disparities, benign neglect, et cetera, as a direct metaphor to challenging white supremacy? And I think, Poe, you kind of touched on this a little bit with the why are we always talking about the Trump voter question, but what do you guys think about this question that Wade asked?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But I would hope that it goes beyond what we see in the news. I think, you know, part of the you know, as a former documentary commissioner and now looking after grants at IDA, you know, oftentimes one sees a lot of films about very surface level idea of what white supremacy and white supremacist structures are. And so they don't go deep and they don't add anything more to what we already see in the news. And we know that what we see in the news also perpetuates white supremacist structures because they don't go deep. So my hope with all our filmmakers who intend to apply for the Pere Lorenz grant is to really think deeply about this theme and how one actually has benefited or inherited or been actually really pained by it, and then to think about the approach and the treatment on how one is going to tell the story. And sometimes, you know, I would say if you're from a community that has been historically disenfranchised and marginalized and discriminated against, you know, maybe the thought process is probably very different because living the experience of white supremacy. But for some folks, it may be more surface level. They may be philosophizing. And so it would be good to go beyond philosophizing and to really feel it and understand it in a meaningful way by surrounding oneself with other filmmakers, other creators, other folks that one wants to have in the team and include them in a meaningful way. And then perhaps the right way to tell the story of white supremacy and how to challenge it will come through.
All right, well, Paul, we really only have like a minute or so left before our hour is up. I was wondering if you had any final thoughts that you wanted to leave people with as they try to develop ideas to qualify for the fund.
Yeah, I would say, you know, so much of all this comes from how honest we can be with ourselves.
Yeah.
And if we cannot be ourselves, if we cannot see who we are, how are we going to help others see what we hope they can, you know, they'll be able to see. And so, you know, for non-BIPOC filmmakers, and especially if you're not Black, Indigenous, Latinx, I would really implore, you know, like think deeply about this theme and try not to tone down language in even conversations outside of making your films and see where you go from there. It's again, very important to see things as they are. I don't know of any film any documentary film that doesn't touch on systemic racism. I mean, so many films you see, all these films coming out from the United States, they all touch on systemic racism in some form. And so they all touch on challenging white supremacy in some form. And so even for folks who are not applying for our Père Laurens grant, as you're making your films, it would be great to reflect very deeply on this, and also to put yourself out there. I mean, so much of what we talk about in terms of our documentary field as a whole is about transparency and accountability. But for a lot of folks, there's a really unease and discomfort in even having these conversations for fear of being called out. And if one is so afraid, then how can one learn? And this, I'm speaking as someone who has had a lot, being educated by friends of color, especially my Black friends, Latinx friends, friends who are undocumented, Indigenous friends. And I learned that I've been wrong many, many, many times. And so as we're making these films, it would be great to really be open, be honest, and to not be afraid. And so I would invite everyone to apply for our Père Laurens grant. And my colleague Dana Merwin and Kenny Brown will be dropping links in the chat. And all I'll say is this: if we haven't learned anything from the past year, I don't know what to say. It's 2021. We laugh. You're laughing.
I tell you one thing we've learned is that white supremacy is resilient. And we always have to be prepared that when we make a step forward, there will be a pushback. And that's the one thing that I'm always encouraging people to see. And documentarians know this better than anyone. It's not continuous progress forward. It's 2 steps forward and a pushback, and 2 steps forward and maybe 2 steps back. And so we can never get too complacent about where we are. And we always have to understand that resistance is coming. I want to thank you guys so much for joining us for this talk. I could talk about this all day, but unfortunately, we only had an hour and we're a little bit past it. If you look in the answer fields, some of the staff have been saying, if you have questions, you can email grants@documentary.org. If you have some questions, and maybe you can have them answered that way. Dana, I don't know if you want to leave folks with a few more tips on how to get a hold of you guys and how to find out more about this. I just want to thank you all very much for inviting me to be a part of this. And I can't wait to see what films get funded as a consequence of choosing this ambitious and entirely appropriate topic.
I couldn't have said it better. Eric, thank you so much. Thank you, Poe, John, Hillary. One final note, we couldn't have done this without our amazing funders and sponsors ourselves. So special thanks to the New York Community Trust, who is our main funder with the Père Laurens Fund, also the Jonathan Logan Family Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, the Los Angeles County Department of Arts and Culture, Department of Cultural Affairs. Yes, IDA needs all of this wonderful support to continue conversations like this, to make films that are so important. Thank you to the filmmakers and everyone in the chat today, and for all of our colleagues at IDA, Nikki, Leanne, Kenny, and Cassidy. And Poe, any other final thoughts, final words?
Thank you to Susan Yin as well, and Maggie Bowman, and most importantly, last but not least, thank you to our outgoing director of IDA, Simon Kilmurray, who has been an amazing support and champion for this and always supporting our independent filmmaking community.
Yes, thank you. And also to Andrea, our ASL interpreter, and Tina, our closed captioning. So it takes a village. Thank you all so much. Have a beautiful Wednesday, and we'll see you soon.
Bye.